Hi, everybody. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for coming. I'm so glad you are here. Today we have Dr. Qwo-Li Driskill, who is an associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. And I met them, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. The meeting was just so vivid in my mind because it was just such a transcendental experience for me, and I'm deeply grateful that they were able to come and share their spirit with this campus and with all of you. Very quick introduction, and then our native students have a presentation. Did I say that right? Okay, I'll move on. I'll move on and give the floor to you in a minute. Okay, so Qwo-Li Driskill is a Cherokee poet, scholar, and activist. And they were raised in rural Colorado. They earned a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Northern Colorado, a Master of Arts from Antioch University in Seattle, and a PhD from Michigan State University. And they do many, many things in the area of arts, and later on this afternoon they will be directing and helping our students produce a theater of the oppressed. But today, at this brown bag, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about their poetry. Driskill's poetry engages themes of inheritance and healing and is rooted in personal Cherokee Two-Spirit, queer, and mixed race experiences. And there are many things that they have written. Among them, Walking with Ghosts, the first poetry collection, and it was named Book of the Month by Sable. And they have also been nominated, or that particular book was nominated for the Griffin Poetry Prize. And there are so many other things I could say. I will not do that. I want you to have as much time as possible with them. Because Qwo-Li is Cherokee, and because we're actually standing on Shoshone land that was stolen from them, I would like to honor the Shoshones as much as we possibly can by asking them if they would like to welcome Dr. Driskill.
Hello, my name is Tyra. I would just like to welcome you guys. So I'm from the Northwestern Shoshone Band, and I'm interning for Alina, and I'm also Vice President Mask. I'd just like to welcome you guys here, and yeah.
Yat Aster Alina Begay and Asia, Ast Eating Nashla, Kislatini Basistin, Nast Ezidina and Dr. Chain, my discus and Dr. Nala. Hi, my name is Alina Begay. I am the Red Streak Bottom people born for the Red House clan. My paternal grandfather is of the Zuni clan, and my maternal grandfather is Zuni clan, and my paternal grandfather is of the Coyote Path people. I'm the multicultural program coordinator here. So I advise the Native students. I also advise the Latino students too. But thank you so much for coming.
Ja, als je de Nisha Sosie en Shia, als je aan zo'n is de kleine basje, put in the shape in between eight. So hello, my name is Denisha Sosie. I am born for the Yucca Fruit Clan people, and I am born for the Bitterwater people clan as well. And I am the Native American City Council president for this year. And as an advisor, so I just want to talk about a little bit what we do for our club. So we do a lot of outreach, and we do weekly meetings. So we try to appropriate like what our stance is for like causes that affect like Native American, and we try to welcome people and try to support us and support others as well. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry. So Paolo is going to do the share on March 16th and 17th in the Field House. And then we also have the Miss American Indian USU pageant. So she's an ambassador for USU, and Tyra is actually Miss American Indian USU this year too. And so she'll be passing the reign on to the next person. So that's February 23rd in the ballroom.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Shio nagada Qwo-Li dawado gialieli nagad ani yonwi ahi elo gialieli ani shoshone ayel gialieli nagad yonwi ni higa. Hi everyone, my name is Qwo-Li. I want to thank the Shoshone peoples whose land we're on and all of you for being here. What I'm going to do is just talk maybe a little bit about some of the work that I do, but part of what the hope was for this event is to have a conversation about gender identity and gender expression and thinking about pronoun usage. And so I'm really going to, hopefully we'll just have a conversation rather than a kind of formal presentation, particularly since I'm not from here and I don't know the particular issues that people are facing and what feels where the conversation needs to go. So you're all the experts in that, and I want to have that remain with you and me learning from you about what it's like here and some of the things that I might be useful for. I am the Queer Studies curriculum organizer at Oregon State University. We have an undergraduate minor as well as minors at the master's and PhD level, and a PhD program in women, gender, sexuality studies. And so that is a lot of my time. My scholarship focuses on the intersections of Indigenous and queer studies and rhetorics and literatures. As was mentioned, I'm a practicing poet and performer. I also do our Southeastern beadwork. I'm pretty new to it. It's under revival right now. It was dormant for a very long time. And Martha Berry, who's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, is really central to reviving that tradition. And I weave baskets as well. And those practices, I think it's important to know that I don't see those as separate from the kind of scholarly work I do. I think in academic spaces, it's really, we like categories a lot. And my work can kind of fall into that, I guess. Whatever people want to say, right? But I don't actually think of these as different projects. What I feel like my work is to advocate for radical social transformation that includes an understanding of how these systems of oppression work together. A lot of my recent scholarship is on examining the kind of representations of Cherokee and other indigenous people in the Southeast in some very early colonial accounts to look at the ways that what we call sexuality and gender now are used as tools of colonization. So to understand that the kind of gender binaries that we assume often are normal and natural, I'm arguing that they're in fact a tool of regulation of indigenous peoples' lands and bodies, and a tool to commit acts of genocide and removal onto indigenous peoples. And in our Southeastern traditions, a lot of that stuff hasn't been written much about. I think that there's often an assumption that colonization happened from a east to west trajectory, and that those of us on the east have less of our traditions and cultures than folks in the West, which isn't true. But what we call Two-Spirit in English, which is an umbrella term for our traditions and Native communities that exist for a lot of us, where gender is not a binary system, that there are those of us who occupy other places and have particular roles and responsibilities. A lot of folks haven't talked much about what happens in the East until fairly recently. And that's partially because in the 80s, white anthropologists who identified as gay started to kind of within a tradition of anthropology at the time, started to be what about gay Indians, basically? And started to write about some histories, like Wiwa, who was a Zuni Two-Spirit person and ambassador to Washington, D.C., and she was also a potter. Will Roscoe did a biography on her, and that really prompted a lot of indigenous people to start to re-examine some of these histories, both the ways that non-Native people have told them, but also in our own traditions. But the histories of what we'd call Two-Spirit activism now, because remember this is an umbrella term that includes lots of different traditions and languages, dates back before that. So I know I'm doing a really quick history lesson, but 1969 marks both the occupation of Alcatraz by United Indians of all tribes, which was a direct confrontation with histories of colonialism in the US, and also the year of the Stonewall Uprising. And a lot of other things were going on at the time. So it was a moment of really imagining that a revolutionary future was possible for people. And I mean that really literally, not metaphorically. The idea was, from a lot of people, was that in solidarity with transnational anti-colonial movements, that folks of color could transform the country through militant, sometimes activism. Part of what happened was that, so in the 70s, American Indian movement emerges. But a lot of these nationalist movements, American Indian movement, Black Panthers, Young Lords, even though they were really important to a transformation of the whole country that sometimes we don't even, at least folks of my generation and younger, aren't always conscious of, but really substantially changed like the material lives of people. They also tended to lean towards a kind of heterosexist, gender binary approach. So what is important about Stonewall was not that it was the first uprising against police brutality in the US by queer and trans people, it wasn't. But what emerged afterwards, because people were already involved with the anti-war movement and the beginnings of women's liberation, and organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. The first groups to form literally days after the Stonewall Uprising was called the Gay Liberation Front. And they used the name Liberation Front in order to tie LGBTQ issues with a larger international struggle against oppression. So at the time, saying gay and liberation or women in liberation was kind of unheard of. But it was a way that people marked their struggles as in solidarity, sometimes in ways that ignored the intersectionality of these identities, but within solidarity of what was called the Third World movement at the time. Gay Liberation Front had folks like Sylvia Rivera, who was a Puerto Rican trans woman. At the time, she identified as a drag queen, who had also been involved with the Young Lords. She was a street worker, she was a teenager, she was homeless a lot of the time. She was involved with Gay Liberation Front. Her mentor, Marsha P. Johnson, was also a member of Gay Liberation Front. And Gay Liberation Front split from the gay activists. Here's what happened. So there was a national case of the Black Panthers being attacked by the police, and lots of leaders were arrested. And folks in Gay Liberation Front wanted to have, folks of color, wanted Gay Liberation Front to support the Panthers. And the white middle class gay people basically were like, we're not supporting Black Panthers. And it split. And in fact, in some ways it split the entire LGBT movement between people who were envisioning a really radically transformative way of being in the future, with folks who kind of wanted to have as much privilege as their straight counterparts, basically. So I'm not linear, if you don't know, I'm not linear. But part of the critiques that came out of what was called the third world feminism at the time, and specifically queer women of color's activism in arts and movements was an insistence not only should our experiences with oppression be understood as intimately tied together, what later was called intersectionality, but that to think of arts and poetry as separate from political theory and activism was a way of marginalizing people of color. And so a lot of my work is really informed by that history and analysis. And I don't really think of all of these as separate things. And I think it's in fact dangerous to think that we can really split apart scholarship from arts, from activism. For me, for instance, basket weaving as a practice, as a Two-Spirit Cherokee person, is really important and I think really radical. I don't care if like dominant culture understands that. In fact, I'd rather they not in some ways, because they tend to take stuff away when they realize that. But I think of that as a really important part of the work that I do and the work that Indigenous communities are doing to reclaim and continue our traditions. So I think that, and here's how I'll move into more of a group conversation. And of course, you're always welcome to ask any questions you have about any of that. But part of the really important critiques of a binary gender system have really come through the labor of queer women of color. There's a really important piece of writing called the Combahee River Collective Statement that some of you may know about, that was written by Black queer women. And though they weren't specifically talking about what we'd call trans issues, what they did point out was that the entire construction of womanhood was closed to Black women, that there was this kind of essentializing notion that women's liberation could take place without understanding that people's experiences with racism and colonialism and heterosexism and classism could somehow be separated, was just another white supremacist project. But those kinds of frameworks are part of, I guess, the way I think of a history of trans liberation. Because part of what they show is that the entire way that we meaning folks in dominant culture, we collectively, imagine gender is already based within very particular cultural concepts that have just become the powerful ones through systems of control. So for instance, in Cherokee, actually, I'm going to go to French for a second. So gender is from French. It's the same as genre. So it's about a category of something. So so when we say gender, we're always talking about trying to categorize people into some kind of box. That's what I mean when I say gender. I'm not talking necessarily even about assigned sex at birth, or perhaps even gender expression or identity. I'm talking about the way people get pushed into particular boxes that tend to be a binary system. So now I'm going to talk about Cherokee. We don't have gender pronouns. There's ways of marking what we call gender, maybe. There was a rhetoric person, and as a poet, I get worried about even saying the word gender because of that history. I'm very nerdy about it. I'm like, I don't know. Gender pronouns don't exist. And that's true for a lot of languages all over the world, in fact, that gender pronouns don't exist. So I think that it's a useful way of understanding how in English and a lot of dominant European languages, gender pronouns are really central. often more central than they are in English, in fact. And understanding that there's a history of languages developing through, in the case of a lot of European languages, empire building and imperialism. So these logics of control become embedded in the language. So part of what trans and gender nonconforming folks are insisting on, and I think even in a larger conversation about pronouns, is first of all pointing out that people have the innate right to determine who they are and have people use the pronouns they ask. And I think for some people that can sound really difficult if you're not familiar with trans and gender nonconforming identities. But one of the things I think is important is that, and I know that there's folks who do work in psychology in the room, so folks can correct me. But one of the most damaging things you can do to another person, particularly to children, is to not see them for who they really are. It's deeply traumatizing. So we do have a situation, I think, in trans communities and broader queer and lesbian and gay and bi communities, where we really experience a kind of collective wounding that happens from the time we're children, even if we have individual families that are accepting, because we have a larger system that wants to insist that we are gender normative and straight, at the very least until proven otherwise, right? So that's that's kind of what heterosexism means, is this assumption that everyone is innately heterosexual and everything else is a deviance from it. But that cultural practice that we have right now wounds people in a really, really deep way. My cane's falling, sorry. So the insistence on making sure that people are using the correct pronouns that people want them to is both an insistence on our humanity as trans and gender nonconforming people, but also a way for some of us, not all trans people have this goal, but a lot of us do, to really topple the way that gender gets worked out in the first place. So I use they, them, their pronouns. I also use the pronoun C, which is S/HE, and here, HIR. But since the emergence of they, them, their in the last handful of years, it's a more easy transition to people. So part of me sometimes wants to make people use the more difficult ones, just to make people have to question the way that we talk. Why do we have to talk about someone and immediately categorize them to be quite frank, it's really based on the shapes of people's genitals. So, sorry if that felt uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable, though. One of the things that happens to us as trans and gender nonconforming people is this, often really, if not overly assertive would maybe be the minimum damage, but a right to know our bodies, a right to understand our histories, really very inappropriate questions that you wouldn't ask a non-trans person about genitals. That kind of thing happens to us often. As someone who is trans feminine, I have non-trans men grab me often. So non-trans women understand this as a larger system of misogyny. This happens to trans feminine people as well. There's a different edge to it. In the US, people may have different numbers, but last year 26 trans people were murdered in the United States. Most of them were Black trans women, probably 24 of those people that are known, right? So even when we're talking about transphobia, if we're not seeing how white supremacy is playing into the way that people are targeted, then we're not really addressing the work, right? We're doing something maybe similar to what the Gay Activist Alliance were doing to try to say, we need included. to have as much privilege as our non-trans counterparts, right? But that won't change anything for most of the people on the planet who are not white and who live under imperialist systems. So this is a soapbox, I do it often. But maybe that's some place to start, is just like how, so here's a question for you all. What are the conversations happening here on campus or in other regional, local contexts around gender identity, trans people, and pronouns that you know of? Yeah. Sure. Or things you've experienced if you identify or get perceived as gender nonconforming. Yeah.
I do want to mention something that I was happy about, and that is that in the International Writing Center community, I'm the Writing Center director here at Utah State. In our Writing Center journal, it might have been 2 or 3 years ago now, the editors said, okay, we are having a pronoun shift. From now on, plural pronouns are just fine with singular subjects. And so I was pleased with that, and I know I have transgender students who are very grateful for that. But I'm really concerned about how people are getting along with the terrible political trauma we're all under at the moment. And so I'm pretty lost as to where this wonderfulness that's starting to happen is getting subsumed by the terribleness.
Well, I'm curious if anyone else has perspectives on that. I have another soapbox to get on, but.
Good.
I mean, here's my soapbox. Okay. I think that part of what we're seeing nationally right now is a backlash to the kinds of really fairly rapid transformations that trans and queer and feminist and people of color communities have made. I mean, I think that what must seem, at least to folks who have never thought about trans people, right, a sudden emergence of a public trans conversation must be very shocking or disconcerting. So when, you know, even of course before the current administration, we started to see these anti-trans bathroom bills emerge, right, that really clearly targeted trans women and trans feminine people. And some activists pointed this out. If you saw anything like on Instagram or Tumblr where trans men would take pictures of themselves in women's restrooms to be like, is this actually what you want? Because a lot of trans men who are on hormone replacement therapy are stealth, we say, in trans communities. They can't be clocked as trans people. Testosterone changes people's bone structure. It changes a lot of things in a way that estrogen doesn't. Once those, after puberty, you can't really, without medical surgery, change much about things like bone structure. So, you know, so there are these trans women being like, in the women's restrooms, being like, is this actually what you want? Because no, that's not who they're imagining as the threat, right? It's about trans women and trans feminine people. And I think it's important to point out as well that a lot of these laws are emerging in the South, where there's already a history of racial segregation. And I think that we need to not imagine that the trans women that they're imagining as a threat are white, because I don't think that's actually people's, and I think it's another route to a white supremacist sort of construction. But I think that like that kind of backlash and this kind of sudden panic about trans people, even though we've been using your restrooms since time immemorial, And quite frankly, it is not trans people who are in danger in restrooms. It's not, did I say that right? Not non-trans people who are in danger, it's us, right? So like, when I'm presenting myself like this, if there's not a gender inclusive restroom, I have to make a decision. Do I go into a space where I could get killed, or do I go into a space where the police will be called? You know, like, or do I just hope that everyone's either too polite or too freaked out to say anything? That's kind of what I hope. I mean, really what I hope is that everyone's like, whatever, we're peeing, it does not matter, right? But that's not how people react. So like, I think some of what we're seeing is a backlash to the kinds of, I think, really fundamental shifts in things like language, you know? Because, again, I think as a rhetoric person and as a poet, I think that that shift in language changes the way that we think and what we think might be possible. I think language is really important in lots of different ways. You know, if language wasn't important, then the US political system would not have tried to eradicate indigenous languages, for instance, right? And this is not just a US issue, this is the way that empire works, is to replace indigenous people's languages with the languages of dominant culture as a system of control, but it also changes the way we think about the world. It takes longer to stop thinking about the world in the old ways than people. Now, I mean, if there's any linguists in the room, please be like, here's the correct information. But what I was told was that the thought structures of language stay with people's families for like 5 generations after the language is no longer spoken. That there's a shift cognitively that happens, you know, so that wasn't the plan of colonizing culture, but language does change what we think is possible. So when there's these shifts to like they, them, their, you know, it was interesting when some of these conversations were online, right? When, if you followed this stuff, like people being like, it's not correct English, blah, you know, as if English is anything except for the way we use it, right? But that kind of like panic over the correctness of it was really fascinating, because actually, first of all, they, them, their as a singular pronoun is used in African American language already. And it's slipped into non-Black language. Like, it's not actually that uncommon to hear people say they, them, like they and mean one person. It's just that when suddenly you say and, it's because some people don't exist in a gender binary, that's when something is like, but it's not correct, right? You know, so I think that there is this backlash that we're seeing is in part because, I mean, it might be, you know, I guess like uncomfortable for people at first with something like they, them, their, but not for very long. Even something like Z and here, which I think is a little more uncomfortable for people, it doesn't take long. I'm like, really, if you really want to do it, a couple days and you're like, it's fine. Yes. Yes.
And so I teach master's students. We draw undergrad and masters from primarily rural Utah and somewhat southern rural Idaho. So a student reported to me that when she suggested on a survey her team project was working on, that she suggested using more than 2 categories for gender. And they said, we're not going to do that. They've got to choose one or the other. And was completely shut down by the other 4 members of our team. So that's part of what we're dealing with here. Just haven't thought outside their narrow little environment.
Mm-hmm. How, for folks who've been in that situation, how have you responded? Because I think that probably a lot of people have been in that, or what you might imagine, yeah.
So in my psychology class, we were kind of doing these little exercises like, which gender do you think does this the most? And our group was supposed to vote. And everyone else in the room was like, okay, men is this %, women is this %, but my group, we did like men, women, and gender queer. And we included all of that, and everyone else was just like,
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah.
Well, I think that that's a useful intervention, right? To like remind people that there's more than 2 categories, probably much more than 3 even, right? I mean, I kind of have the opinion that there are many genders as there are people, but we don't necessarily think of it that way, right? But if you start to do, you know, like kind of educational work that is like thinking about these categories and what men are supposed to do and what men and women are supposed to do, there's not very many people that fit into like legitimate men and legitimate women. Like most people do not actually at all, but we kind of consent to the system anyway, yeah. What are some, yes?
I'm curious, what about drawing the parallel to the same categories we try to force people in to mark what race they are? And many would mark other just simply because they don't fit in the rest of the boxes. Same thing for marital status. Like personally, I identify as both a widow and married.
Right.
Because I have remarried, and I would love to be able to check both of those boxes a lot of times. But that idea of forcing people to select one. And I understand it from a data perspective, because doing research, you want data you can use, and that makes it more complicated. So I guess my question is, how do you approach that as a scholar when you're doing surveys and helping people understand that? How do you kind of help work through that conundrum?
Well, to be clear, I don't do quantitative research. I do qualitative work. But I think part of what I would, thinking about people's methodologies is actually like kind of questioning what happens when this happens is that we're actually creating the conditions for the data to repeat itself, right? So like this happens to Native people all the time. We're considered statistically insignificant constantly. So then people are like, well, there's no point to even like mark Indigenous people because there's, depending on who you ask, we're only, 0.5 to 1.5% of the population. So like we become statistically insignificant. Unless people are doing research on Indigenous experiences, in which case we tend to have the most astronomically disproportionate awful of everything, actually. But if you're like, well, there are not very many of them, so, and I think that same thing happens. Like if the point of data is more than just kind of archiving and regulation of people, and it is trying to find out maybe something that's happening, then to me that would be why to just allow more than one option or just let people just say, right? Like I think of myself this way. It just happened just recently in Oregon, and I, I'm critically wary of the state, just saying, but I worry about us being, people who've been targeted historically being on the radar of people with guns, frankly. But Oregon just changed to include a third gender option on IDs in order for people who don't identify within a gender binary. And I do want to remind folks that a lot of trans men and women do identify in a gender binary. Another option. And to me, then, this might bring us to some other kinds of conclusions if we're looking at data. Because, like we don't necessarily know how many trans and gender nonconforming people there are because it's never asked, right? It's just this cycle of like, well, we don't know. And I think it's a way of being like, there are less of them than, there's not very many, right? Because like, there's a lot of estimates that 1 in 200 births is an intersex person. That's a significant part of the world, right? But then you get these arguments of there are only 2 biological sexes. But if 1 in 200 people are born with intersex conditions, that's not true, So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it maybe brings up a question about our methods and methodologies and how we, if we're not really conscious, we ask questions that just confirm the reality that we think exists, And I think that's such an important intervention that feminist studies, feminist science studies has pointed out, for instance, to be able to be like, we are putting all of our people stuff on the rest of the entire more than human world all the time. There's histories of like data on, I don't know, even when we're talking about non-humans, how to say this, but like animals that don't conform to what people think their gender categories are, and animals that have same-sex relations in sex. That data was like suppressed for a very, very long time, right? So then it could be like, this is natural and normal. And this is not, but if we have all this other data, right? I don't know if that's helpful.
So it's just I've been here for a semester and a week now, pretty much. But what I have noticed in terms of these conversations is very abstract discourse on what is natural, normal, the way it has always been, etc. I had a student say that early on in an intro to ethnic studies course last semester about binary genders and heteronormativity. And the student just said, it's just natural and it's the way it's always been. And obviously it's a good teachable moment to say that's absolutely untrue. But I paused and waited to see if anybody was going to complicate this, and no one did. And so I do think that's the discourse that seems to circulate here in particular, in greater ways than other places I've lived before.
How do people counter that? Or might you? Or if you want to talk more about that.
I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I'm not answering yours.
Okay.
But, how are you able to talk about these things with absolutely no bitterness at all? With just this, this gorgeous energy. And I hope you can feel the energy that you've brought into this room. There's just not a drop of acrimony. How do you do it?
I don't know. That's really generous. I appreciate that. Sometimes I'm very angry, but I feel like, I guess, really fortunate and privileged to be able to have these kinds of conversations with people, and I think it's important. I think that like us being able to engage with these issues, if we're going to imagine the world we want to live in, are necessary. And I think that, I think it's more useful to try to build something else than build an alternative, right? Than to just, I think that in women, gender, and sexuality studies as a discipline, and critical ethnic studies, and a lot of our disciplines, things ended a critique too much. And I think that critique is necessary and we have to have it, but not always like, and then the rest of this, right? Like, historically, women, gender, and sexuality studies when it began as women's studies, thought of itself as the academic arm of the women's liberation movement. And as many critiques as we might have about that particular genealogy, I like the idea, and ethnic studies is the same situation. It started with student strikes in San Francisco. What is San Francisco State University now? But there's always been like, all of this stuff is actually to change things. And so if we're going to, then I think, I don't know if I have the energy to, quite frankly, this last year, I've had to have, my energy has not gone towards anger as much as like trauma. That is the truth. It is traumatizing. It makes me think about, one of the things I see happening is a collective trauma. Historical trauma is taking place right now. That I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom, but I do think we're going to be dealing with for generations. And I think that kind of knowledge is from being an Indigenous person and knowing that we carry these old legacies, So it's not that what's happening is new. It is not new. It is, in fact, as old as this country. But that familiarity to me is traumatizing. And I don't think just me. I think a collective me, us, it's traumatizing. So really, like, I don't have the energy to be bitter, even if I'm angry. I just can't survive.
Yeah.
Right? And that's, I don't know.
I just want to go back to a statement you made that just left me pretty devastated when you said you have to make a choice when you go into a bathroom whether you'd like to be killed or have the police called. And that's what you're describing right now is this trauma there. How can we help people here, you and we recognize that I wasn't even aware of that choice. How do we support individuals in, how do we?
Well, I think the kind of work that sounds to me from my brief hours here is happening is to support trans and gender nonconforming students and to listen to what they experience and to support them in the, to build some coalitions between, one would think this was natural at a university, we all know that's not the case, but coalitions with students who are doing this kind of work. I did find a gender-inclusive restroom here. I was very happy because I don't know the space, so I didn't know what I was going to be. But, at a lot of campuses, there have been like major student demonstrations to make sure that there is gender-inclusive restrooms. And in fact, just like, I like this, but I'm a little sassy, but like just reclaiming bathrooms, just like putting signs over the signs that are like gender-inclusive restroom, and just like, done. We're just going to replace the signs, yeah.
So a couple of years ago, we did go through a curriculum identifying single-cell restrooms that could be trans in addition to nursing and handicapped and everything else. But we didn't quite get that. For example, in engineering, the person building the engineering, why do we have to do these single-cell restrooms? And the women dean said, it's the law, you're going to do it. You're going to squeeze out that space, you give up a little research space, you have a space. So we've made some of that. But for example, in my building, there's one there, and it's got no sign on it. I've asked for a nursing mother sign on it. I would hope to get a gender nonconforming, but it's just there. And,
Yep.
and the associate dean's complaining, it's the least used restroom in the whole building. And he agreed to put a sign up, but anyway, it hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm curious how you find or create space for yourself within like a gender binary world. One thing I know I struggle with a lot is like I feel like I'm not allowed in either women's spaces or men's spaces, even though I identify with issues from both sides.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, like how like the whole world is built around this idea that everyone is in one of these categories. How are you able to find a place where you feel like you're in your place, I guess?
Well, I think the part of how I've done that is to find other like-minded people, whether that's people who are also gender nonconforming or not, I guess is not as relevant in some ways as like creating the kind of communities. Even, so I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. I'm guessing it's not changed since then, but it was very dangerous, very, very conservative and dangerous. It still haunts me a bit, quite frankly, but what was really, I think, incredible is that we created a really tight community that was really, I mean, I have to say, sometimes I'm like, how did we get through it? We were nervy. I don't think I thought we were at the time, but looking back, maybe it's because I'm older and I'm like, oh my goodness, how do children, I don't know. But I think that that's important is creating those spaces and being like, if we can, how do we build those spaces? And maybe that's just having gatherings in people's homes, Like, it's important to remember that so many of our movements for social justice didn't have any resources. We just met wherever, started talking about our lives, and then changed the world, right? So I think that's part of it, is to just start to create the space that you want. And I think that for me, as dangerous as it is to live outside of a gender binary in this country, what is useful, and I think useful in having those numerous and different experiences, is that I think that we have a perspective on the way that gender and sexuality function that is embodied knowledge that's different, right? Like, since different points in my life and sometimes throughout the day, depending on my mood, like I'm perceived as different genders. I've probably been perceived as lots of different genders. And one of the things that helps me realize is that gender is people's own stuff. It's not my stuff. It's their stuff. Because they'll put me in whatever category is most comfortable for them, even on a very subconscious level. And so like I can't change if they're gonna say, if I say where's the restroom and they point me to the women's or the men's or like, I don't know where you are or whatever, you know. And that like, I think that we have a perspective on the way that issues of like misogyny function, you know, because we might experience some, like in some spaces being, I mean, I can tell when I'm being perceived as gender nonconforming or I'm perceived as a man or a woman pretty fast. It's pretty obvious if you move through gender spaces, like how people are treated differently, right? And if people occupy one gender space, they might not experience that, but I think that then that means, well, we have a different perspective on how maybe to change this too, because we can move through the world in a different way, and I think that's a real gift. So I think remembering that like having that perspective is needed in the world helps me, you know. Yes.
So, as you know, Christianity was forced upon natives, and you know, only man and a woman. So how do you talk to natives who are, you know, who grew up with only that, but then they don't understand the two-spiritness and our traditional ways?
Mm-hmm.
Do you talk to them differently, and how do you approach that with them?
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, there's some really great writing and scholarship, if you are already familiar with it, by folks like Jennifer Denatal and Wesley Thomas. And Wesley Thomas, who is a Dene scholar and anthropologist, one of the things that he has pointed out in his scholarship, and he's Nasle, two-spirit person, is that there's a direct parallel between people who speak Dene and their understandings of more than two genders and people who only speak English, and that there's a direct parallel. So that might be at least a conversation in, right? That like, those who continue the older traditions and who speak the language know that there's a different way, right? And that, you know, there are creation stories that include more than one gender, or more than two genders. And I think that like in Cherokee communities, so here's a story that was told to me by someone I consider my elder, but is much younger, about a decade younger. But she is fluent in Cherokee. I'm a baby talker. I'm relearning, and so she's fluent in Cherokee, and she grew up in Oklahoma. And she was telling a group of, this is at a semi-public event at a Two-Spirit gathering, that she was talking to her elders in Oklahoma who are part of the traditional communities in English. They all know her, they know her family, they know who she is. And was asking about like, well, are there people like me? And they were like, no, that's so weird. No, no. And then she switched into Cherokee and they were like, yeah, of course. Of course there are people like you, but they wouldn't say it in English. And that's really telling to me too. You know, and one of the things that she said, told us, was that she was told by her elders that it wasn't until like the 1950s that you stopped seeing Two-Spirit, what we call Two-Spirit people in English, at the ceremonial grounds, which really goes in the face of some of the stories I think that we tell in Two-Spirit communities, that some of these ways were closed off very early on, that it's actually like as much connected to things like the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. And of course, people are practicing their ceremonies illegally still in the 1950s. But you know, I don't know if that's useful or not, but one of the things that Two-Spirit organizing has done is to make a lot of the Two-Spirit activists and the Two-Spirit gatherings, which are gatherings of Two-Spirit people that happen all over North America, is saying, you know, in a lot of our traditions, we carry these lifeways, and we're coming back into the circle of who we are. And sometimes it means showing elders over and over again, like, we know our protocols, like, we're learning our languages, we're teaching other people, we're doing this stuff, and just, I think, being like, this is who we are, I think as more people are presenting themselves as Two-Spirit people to the world, that more things are kind of coming back to us, you know. So maybe it's just continuing to have the conversation, or to be like, that's fine, you know, people have whatever belief system, it's okay if you're Christian and whatever. And just remember, you know, that's not our story originally. It might be now. We may have taken that story too and used it for how we need, but it's not, it's new. And actually, I gotta say that for dominant culture, like you were pointing out, the idea of homosexuality is new too. New. Real new. Like 19th century, and in the US, some of the like sodomy laws that included what now we call gay, lesbian, bi people didn't exist until like 1915, which is, again, much later than, that's when some of this stuff is new. So, you know, I think that in Native communities, here's just another story. I know that how much time do we have?
It's actually time to be wrapping up.
Okay, I'll end with this then. Deborah Miranda, who is an Indigenous Two-Spirit writer, she has a great essay called The Extermination of the Hoyas. And she's Ohlone and Chumash, so Indigenous from California. And it's a great essay. You can get it through your library. I'm sure it's in GLQ. But she talks about how in California history, the people that we call Two-Spirit now in English, in a lot of traditions were the people who were responsible for being midwives and also for burials. So when the Spanish missions came and they started to exterminate who they perceived as sodomites, the people who held the knowledge of what to do with the dead were being killed at the same moment where one of the most horrendous genocides on the planet in California occurred, right? So there was a simultaneous mass death happening, and then the people who knew the way to make sure that everything was handled correctly were no longer there, or were being forced into separate men's and women's roles, you know. And what that makes me think of is how when we, and Elle Frank, so there's other, Elle Frank is an activist who's from California, Indigenous activist, and she is Two-Spirit, and she does a lot of repatriation work, you know, and so Miranda like points to that as like, here's a contemporary practice, you know, but I think as we go back to our practices, I mean, I think a lot of the things that are messed up in the world for Indigenous people are because a lot of times the people who are responsible for things like mediation and moments between life and death and counseling and taking care of children who didn't have other parents, we're the ones who did that work, right? So then if we're taken out of the circle, everything starts to unravel, because that's why we're there, is to keep the balance in a lot of our communities. So that, I think, is hopeful, because we are coming back to that circle, and being like, yeah, we've never left, you know, and we're picking our tools up again, and I think that will change everything. What-o, thank you, y'all.
Dr. Austin did have to slip out. She has some other obligations to attend to. I'm her graduate student, Breon Nielsen. We just want to thank Qwo-Li again for spending time with us and bringing this wonderful energy to our space. Prior to leaving, our Native students do need an additional moment. They have something.
I would just like to provide a gift.
Oh.
I really love your talk.
Oh, Oh, no.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can I give you a hug?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.